In life, there are moments when we face people who will challenge us, hurt us, betray us, and perhaps even misunderstand us. And in those moments, we are often tempted to react, to fight back, to defend ourselves, to correct the wrongs, to argue our case, to respond to every accusation, to speak out against every injustice. But let me tell you, there is a far greater strength in silence than in speaking. There is a far more powerful way to respond than to simply react. That way is to cut them off silently. It is not weakness to remain silent, it is strength. It is not a lack of courage to walk away, it is wisdom. We live in a world that constantly tells us to react, to fight back, to make sure our voice is heard, to stand up for ourselves, to defend our honor, and to make sure that no one can ever misunderstand us. But what does the Bible teach us about how to respond when we are wronged? What does Christ teach us when we are unjustly treated, when we are falsely accused, when we are misunderstood, when we are wounded? In Matthew 5, Jesus tells us to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. He doesn't say to go after them with arguments or insults. He doesn't say to react in anger or frustration. He says to love them. And how do we love them? We do so by walking away silently. There is great power in not responding to evil with evil, but in responding to evil with good. And sometimes the best good you can do is to say nothing. You see, the Bible teaches us that there are times when silence is the loudest message we can give. It is a declaration of strength, of maturity, of knowing that you are not bound by the whims of others, that you are not enslaved by the need to always be right, to always be heard, to always be understood. There is a tremendous power in simply walking away from situations where you are being mocked, belittled, and unjustly treated. When we respond in anger, we lower ourselves to the level of the one who is provoking us. But when we remain silent, we rise above their petty provocations. We rise above their insults and their attempts to drag us down into the mud with them. Silence is not weakness. It is the refusal to allow others to control your emotions, to dictate your actions, to control your peace. Christ was the perfect example of this. When he was falsely accused, when he was beaten, when he was mocked, when he was condemned to die on a cross, he did not react. He did not fight back. He did not justify himself. He remained silent. He knew that his mission was not to defend himself, but to fulfill the will of his Father. And in his silence, he spoke volumes. He spoke of his trust in the sovereignty of God. He spoke of his confidence in God's justice. He spoke of his love for the people who were wronging him, because he understood that his suffering was not in vain. It was for their salvation. There are times when silence is the best response, because in silence we are acknowledging something that is far more important than our need to be understood, far more important than our need to be right, and far more important than our desire to correct every wrong. In silence, we are acknowledging the sovereignty of God. We are acknowledging that he is in control. We are acknowledging that at the end of the day, the opinions of men do not define us. It is only the opinion of God that matters. When we cut people off silently, we refuse to allow their actions to dictate our response. We refuse to allow their words to shape our thoughts, to shape our emotions, to shape our behavior. And in doing so, we show that we are not slaves to the whims of men, but servants of God. But don't be mistaken, this is not about being passive or indifferent to the situation. This is not about simply walking away and pretending that nothing happened. It is about choosing to rise above the situation. It is about making a conscious decision that your peace is more important than your pride, that your emotional health is more important than your need to justify yourself, that your relationship with God is more important than your desire to win the argument. We are told in Proverbs that a soft answer turns away wrath. But it doesn't just stop at giving a soft answer. It goes further. Sometimes the softest answer is no answer at all. The softest response is not to respond. The softest response is to walk away, not in defeat, but in victory. Because in your silence, you are showing that you are free from the need to fight for yourself. You are free from the need to react in ways that only escalate the situation. You are free to leave the matter in God's hands, knowing that He will bring about justice in His time according to His will. We live in a world that thrives on noise. We are constantly bombarded by the opinions of others, the voices of the world, the constant clamor for attention, the constant pull to react, to engage, to respond, to defend ourselves. But the wisdom of the Bible calls us to step away from the noise, to be still, and to know that He is God. In a world that constantly tries to provoke us, we are called to respond differently, not with words, not with actions, but with silence. Silence does not mean that we are giving up, that we are conceding defeat. No, silence is a declaration of trust in God. It is a declaration that we believe God is greater than the wrongs done against us. It is a declaration that we believe God will fight for us. It is a declaration that we believe God is sovereign, that He sees the truth, and that in His time He will bring about justice. And let me tell you, there are people who will try to provoke you. There are people who will try to get a reaction out of you. They will throw insults at you. They will speak lies about you. They will attempt to undermine you. They will try to provoke you into a response, to drag you down to their level. But the greatest thing you can do is not to react. The greatest thing you can do is to silently cut them off. Let them speak their words. Let them make their accusations. Let them tell their lies. But you don't need to defend yourself. You don't need to fight back. You don't need to react. You are free from the need to prove yourself because you know who you are in Christ. Sometimes people will misunderstand you. They will accuse you. They will talk about you behind your back. They will spread lies, gossip, and slander. But remember this, God knows the truth. You don't need to fight for your reputation. God will protect it. You don't need to clear your name. God will do it in His time. In fact, in many cases, your silence is the most powerful weapon you have. When people are expecting you to react, when they're expecting you to defend yourself, when they're expecting you to get angry or upset, your silence will confound them. It will show them that you are not moved by their words, that you are not controlled by their actions, and that you are not a slave to the opinions of men. But let me be clear, this is not about avoiding confrontation for the sake of avoiding conflict. It's not about being passive in the face of injustice. There are times when we must speak up, when we must stand for truth, when we must confront sin. But there are also times when silence is the most powerful response. There are times when cutting people off silently is the most godly and wise thing you can do. So, when the attacks come, when the misunderstandings arise, when the gossip spreads, when the accusations are made, remember this, you don't have to react. You don't have to defend yourself. You don't have to justify yourself. Instead, silently walk away. Let God be your defender. Let God be your voice. Let God fight for you. And in the silence, let your trust in God speak louder than any words you could ever say. The speech emphasizes that remaining silent in the face of provocation or injustice is not weakness, but a powerful display of strength and wisdom. Instead of reacting emotionally or defending oneself, choosing silence demonstrates trust in God's sovereignty and shows maturity in handling conflict. The speech draws from the example of Jesus Christ, who, when falsely accused and mistreated, remained silent. This act of silence was not passive, but a conscious decision to trust in God's plan, showing that sometimes the best response is not to react, but to leave the matter in God's hands. The core message is that silence in difficult situations reflects a deep trust in God's justice and timing. By cutting people off silently, we refuse to let the actions of others control our emotions and behavior, and instead we surrender the situation to God, knowing He will act on our behalf when the time is right. There is a deep, profound strength in silence that is often misunderstood, especially in a world that thrives on noise. We live in a society that equates silence with weakness, passivity, and even cowardice. We are told time and again that in order to be strong, we must assert ourselves, speak up, make our voice heard, defend our rights, and stand our ground. But what if true strength is found not in speaking out, but in holding our tongue? What if the greatest display of wisdom is not found in reacting to every slight, every injustice, or every insult, but in choosing to remain silent? Silence in the face of provocation is often viewed as a form of retreat, but it is in fact a choice, a deliberate act of restraint, a refusal to be controlled by the emotions, actions, and words of others. When we choose silence, we are not surrendering to the situation. We are asserting control over our own hearts and minds. In a world that constantly calls us to react, to defend ourselves, and to make sure that we are always heard, silence is a profound act of strength. It is the ability to refuse to be governed by external circumstances and instead to govern our own response. The world may encourage you to lash out, to stand up for your rights, to make sure people know where you stand. But there is another way, a higher way, a way that requires strength and wisdom, and that is to remain silent. There is a deep, often unspoken power in silence. When we respond in silence, we are demonstrating that we are not bound by the fleeting emotions of the moment. We are not controlled by the desire to be right, to be understood, or to justify ourselves. Instead, we are choosing to rise above the situation, to transcend the conflict, and to hold on to something greater. The world tells us that we must react to everything, that every slight, every insult, every offense requires a response. But silence is the choice to let go of the need to control the narrative, to surrender the situation to God, and to trust in His sovereignty and wisdom. In moments of conflict or misunderstanding, there is an opportunity to exercise incredible strength in silence. When we choose not to respond to slander, not to answer insults, and not to fight back against accusations, we are taking a stand, though it may seem like doing nothing. We are refusing to be drawn into a cycle of retaliation and bitterness. We are choosing to rise above the pettiness of the situation and to place our trust in something greater than our own need for validation. In the world's eyes, silence may seem like passivity, but in the eyes of God, it is strength. Strength to resist the pull of our flesh, strength to trust in His plan, and strength to let go of the desire for control. Silence is not about indifference. It is not about avoiding responsibility or neglecting the need to address wrongdoing. Rather, silence is about choosing the right moment to speak and the right way to speak. There are times when silence is the most powerful tool we have in our arsenal. There are times when speaking up only serves to escalate the conflict, to fuel the fire of anger, and to prolong the tension. In those moments, silence is the wise choice. It is not an admission of defeat, nor is it an unwillingness to confront injustice. Instead, it is an exercise of wisdom, knowing when to speak and when to hold your tongue. In fact, silence can be the most potent weapon against those who seek to provoke you. People who insult or attack us often do so because they want a reaction. They want us to respond in anger, to defend ourselves, to make sure that our voice is heard. When we withhold that reaction, when we choose not to engage, we take away their power. They may try to drag us into their drama, but we refuse to participate. In that refusal, we take control of the situation. Silence is not about giving up or surrendering. It is about choosing not to participate in something that does not deserve our attention or energy. The power of silence also lies in its ability to reveal our character. When we remain silent in the face of provocation, we are demonstrating self-control, patience, and maturity. We are showing that we are not governed by our emotions, that we are not ruled by the whims of those around us. In a world where everyone is quick to speak, quick to react, and quick to defend themselves, silence stands out as a testimony of inner strength. It is a declaration that we are not like the world, that we do not respond in the same way that others do. While the world reacts in anger and frustration, we choose to respond with quiet strength and restraint. Silence also speaks to the depth of our faith. When we choose silence in the midst of conflict, we are expressing our trust in God's sovereignty. We are acknowledging that God is in control, that He sees what is happening, and that He will handle the situation in His perfect timing. In those moments, our silence is not an act of inaction, it is an act of faith. It is a declaration that we believe God is bigger than the situation, that He is greater than the offense, and that He will bring about justice in His own time and in His own way. We trust that God will vindicate us, that He will defend our reputation, and that He will take care of those who seek to harm us. Furthermore, silence allows us the space to reflect and seek God's will. When we are confronted with injustice, our natural inclination is often to react, to speak out, to argue, to set the record straight. But silence provides the opportunity to step back, to breathe, and to seek God's guidance. In those quiet moments, we can ask ourselves, what does God want me to do in this situation? How does He want me to respond? Silence gives us the time and the space to listen to God's voice, to hear His instructions, and to align our hearts with His will. It prevents us from acting in the flesh, out of anger or frustration, and helps us to respond in a way that honors God. There is a wisdom in silence that goes beyond merely holding our tongues. It requires an awareness of the bigger picture, a recognition that our actions and words have consequences, and that sometimes the best course of action is to say nothing at all. Silence teaches us to trust that God is in control and that He is at work in ways we cannot always see. It teaches us to wait patiently for His timing and to trust that His plan is better than our own. In the book of Proverbs, we are told that a soft answer turns away wrath, Proverbs 15:51, and there is great wisdom in this. However, there are times when a soft answer is not necessary, because a response at all would only serve to escalate the situation. In those moments, silence is the answer. It is a response that speaks volumes without saying a word. It communicates that we are not easily swayed by the words of others, that we are not easily provoked, and that we are secure in our identity and in God's plan for our lives. The Apostle Peter, in his first letter, exhorts believers to live in such a way that even if they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. 1 Peter 2:12. This is the power of silence, the ability to demonstrate the truth of the gospel through our actions rather than through our words. When we choose silence, we are allowing our lives to speak louder than our words ever could. We are choosing to trust that God will use our actions and our restraint to glorify Himself and to bring others to Christ. Silence is not always easy. It requires discipline, self-control, and humility. It requires the strength to resist the urge to defend ourselves, to make our case, to prove our point. It requires the humility to acknowledge that we do not need to be right, that we do not need to be understood, and that we do not need to have the last word. It requires the faith to trust that God is in control, that He is at work in ways we cannot see, and that He will bring about justice in His perfect timing. But in this silence, we find strength. Strength to rise above the situation, strength to remain calm in the face of provocation, and strength to trust that God is greater than anything we face. And this is the wisdom of silence. To know when to speak and when to remain silent, to know when to act and when to wait. It is the wisdom to understand that silence is not an absence of action, but an intentional choice to trust in God's wisdom and sovereignty. It is the wisdom to recognize that there are times when our words will only cause harm, and that in those moments, silence is the most powerful thing we can do. So let us embrace the strength and wisdom found in silence. Let us learn to trust God more fully, to rely on His timing, and to refuse to be governed by the actions and words of others. Let us find power in our restraint, peace in our stillness, and confidence in our quiet trust in Him. In every aspect of life, we are called to follow Christ, to emulate His character, and to live as He lived. His life was a perfect example of how we should respond to the world around us, especially in times of injustice, suffering, and conflict. One of the most striking aspects of Christ's life was His unwavering commitment to remain silent in the face of false accusations. He did not respond to provocation in the way the world might expect. Instead, He chose to follow a higher path, a path that was marked by restraint, humility, and absolute trust in the sovereignty of God. His example is one that we are to imitate, particularly when we are wronged, mistreated, or misunderstood. Christ's silence was not a sign of weakness, nor was it an unwillingness to confront evil. It was an act of obedience to the will of God, an expression of his trust in his Father, and a demonstration of the strength that comes from surrendering control to God's greater purpose. Throughout his ministry, Jesus consistently chose to respond with silence when confronted with accusations and hostility, and his response to those who sought to destroy him offers profound lessons for us today. Consider the moments leading up to his crucifixion. Jesus was arrested on false charges, mocked, beaten, and condemned by the very people he came to save. The religious leaders and the Roman authorities alike sought to discredit him, to strip him of his dignity, and to silence his voice. Yet in the midst of it all, Jesus did not open his mouth to defend himself. He did not argue, protest, or seek to explain himself. Instead, he remained silent. His silence was not a form of denial or passivity, but a powerful declaration of his faith in the sovereignty of God and his commitment to fulfill the will of his Father. In the book of Matthew, we read about Jesus' trial before the high priest. The religious leaders brought false witnesses against him, accusing him of blasphemy. But Jesus did not respond to their accusation, but Jesus remained silent, the gospel tells us, Matthew 26:63. His silence in the face of false testimony was a stark contrast to what the world might expect from someone facing such serious charges. The world might say, fight back, defend yourself, prove your innocence. But Jesus knew that his mission was not to vindicate himself, but to fulfill the redemptive purpose for which he had been sent. Jesus' silence before his accusers is not merely an example for us to follow. It is a profound demonstration of the strength that comes from surrendering our need to defend ourselves to God. Christ did not need to defend his honor because he knew his Father was with him, and he trusted that God's plan would unfold exactly as it was meant to. He knew that in the end, his death would serve a higher purpose, one that would bring salvation to the world. His silence in that moment was a declaration of his trust in the Father's plan, even when it appeared to be falling apart in the eyes of the world. We also see this silence in Jesus' response to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. Pilate, the Roman official overseeing Jesus' trial, was baffled by Jesus' behavior. He asked Jesus why he did not defend himself against the accusations being made, but Jesus' response was simple. You would have no authority over me if it were not given to you from above. John 19:11. Here once again, Jesus refuses to argue or defend himself. He acknowledges the authority of Pilate, but ultimately places his trust in the sovereign will of God. Jesus knew that the ultimate authority in this situation was not Pilate, nor the religious leaders, but his Father in heaven. His silence in the face of authority was not a sign of defeat, but a powerful testimony of his belief in the greater purpose of his suffering. Jesus also demonstrated silence in the face of personal attacks and misunderstandings throughout his ministry. The Gospels are filled with stories of people who misunderstood him, who falsely accused him, or who sought to discredit his ministry. Yet time and again, Jesus chose not to engage with these attacks. He did not try to explain himself to every critic. He did not seek to defend his actions or his motives. Instead, he continued to focus on his mission, on teaching the truth, and on doing the will of his Father. He did not allow the opinions of others to distract him or to alter his course. In Luke 23, we see another example of Jesus' silence when he is brought before Herod. Herod had heard of Jesus and was curious to see him perform a miracle, but when Jesus stood before him, he remained silent. He gave no answer, Luke 23:9. Even though Herod and his soldiers mocked him and treated him with contempt, this silence is significant because it shows that Jesus was not concerned with satisfying the curiosity of those who had no intention of believing in him. He was not willing to perform for the entertainment of those who sought to use him for their own selfish purposes. He was more concerned with the Father's will than with the expectations of the people around him. Christ's silence before his accusers serves as a model for us when we are confronted with unjust treatment, misunderstanding, or hostility. In our own lives, we often encounter situations where we are falsely accused, where people misinterpret our actions, or where we are unjustly treated. In those moments, our natural inclination is often to defend ourselves, to justify our actions, or to correct the record. But Jesus' example teaches us that there are times when silence is the most powerful response we can give. It is not because we are defeated or passive, but because we trust in God's sovereignty and we recognize that his purposes will prevail, regardless of the misunderstandings and accusations that may come our way. When we are wronged, our desire for justice can sometimes drive us to speak out, to correct the lies, to fight for our reputation. However, Jesus shows us that there is a higher way, an approach that focuses not on defending ourselves, but on entrusting ourselves to God's justice. He did not need to justify himself because he knew that God would ultimately bring about justice. Jesus' silence was not a denial of the injustice he faced, but a declaration that he was trusting in the Father to handle the situation according to his perfect will. Following Christ's example means that we are willing to remain silent when we are wronged, knowing that our silence does not make us weak, but rather strengthens our trust in God's plan. In those moments, we recognize that we are not in control of the situation, but that God is. Our silence is an act of faith, a declaration that we are surrendering the outcome to him. It is a willingness to follow Jesus' example and to trust that he will bring about justice in his own time, in his own way. Furthermore, following Christ's example in silence means that we recognize that our lives are not about proving ourselves or seeking the approval of others. Jesus, in his silence, was not concerned with defending his honor or protecting his reputation. He was focused on fulfilling his mission, on accomplishing the will of his Father. In the same way, when we are wronged or misunderstood, we are called to keep our eyes fixed on the greater purpose for which we have been called. Our goal is not to vindicate ourselves, but to live faithfully and obediently to God, trusting that he will be the one to defend us. Christ's silence also shows us that there are times when speaking up will only serve to escalate the situation. In moments of conflict, we are often tempted to react quickly, to defend ourselves, to argue, or to retaliate. But Jesus teaches us that there are times when silence is the wisest choice. It is a way of refusing to be drawn into the conflict, of resisting the temptation to fight for our own honor, and of trusting in God's wisdom and timing. By remaining silent, we create space for God to work, for his justice to unfold, and for his glory to be revealed. Jesus' example of silence is not a call to passivity, but to active trust in God's sovereignty. It is an invitation to lay down our need for control, to relinquish our desire for justice on our own terms, and to follow the path of humility and submission to God's will. His silence was not a retreat from the world, but an active expression of his total trust in the Father's plan. And this is the example we are called to follow, to remain silent when the world demands that we speak, to trust in God's timing, and to rest in the knowledge that he will vindicate us in his perfect time. By following Christ's example of silence, we learn to respond to the world with grace, humility, and trust. We learn that silence is not weakness but strength, not passivity but active faith. We learn that God is in control and that his purposes are far greater than our immediate circumstances. And we learn that in following Christ, we can find peace and strength even in the midst of suffering, knowing that he is with us and that he will bring about his perfect plan. In a world that encourages us to react quickly, speak up immediately, and defend ourselves at every turn, silence can feel like a foreign concept. It is counterintuitive to our natural instincts, especially in times of injustice, mistreatment, or misunderstanding. Yet silence can be one of the most profound and powerful ways to declare our trust in God. When we choose silence, especially when faced with provocation, We are making a conscious decision to trust that God is in control and that He will handle the situation in His perfect timing. Silence in this context is not the absence of action, nor is it a sign of weakness. Rather, it is a deliberate expression of faith and surrender, a declaration that we trust in God's sovereignty, justice, and wisdom. Choosing silence is often misunderstood. The world may see silence as a passive response, something that conveys defeat, avoidance, or fear. But in reality, silence can be a powerful act of faith. When we remain silent in the face of unfairness, accusations, or hurt, we are making a statement. We are declaring that we do not need to fight for ourselves, defend our reputation, or demand justice. We are saying, God is in control. I trust Him to handle this. This is a radical departure from the world's mindset, which often tells us that silence is for the weak, that standing up for ourselves is a sign of strength. But in God's kingdom, true strength is found in surrendering to His will, in letting go of the need to control the outcome, and in trusting that He knows what is best for us. The Bible is filled with examples of individuals who chose silence as a way of declaring their trust in God. Perhaps the most striking example is found in the life of Jesus Christ. Throughout His ministry, He encountered countless opportunities to defend Himself, to justify His actions, or to fight back against the injustices He faced. Yet time and again, He chose silence as the ultimate expression of His trust in His Father's plan. Jesus understood that His mission was not to fight for His own rights or to prove His innocence to those who misunderstood Him. His mission was to fulfill the will of His Father, even if that meant suffering injustice, humiliation, and ultimately death. When Jesus was arrested and brought before the religious leaders and Pilate, He was falsely accused, mocked, and mistreated, yet He remained silent in the face of these accusations. In Matthew 26, verses 63, we are told that Jesus remained silent when the high priest demanded that He speak. He did not defend Himself. He did not argue or try to convince the authorities of His innocence. Instead, He remained silent, trusting that God's plan was unfolding as it should. In His silence, Jesus was declaring His absolute trust in the Father's will. He knew that the path before Him would lead to suffering, but He also knew that this suffering was necessary for the fulfillment of God's redemptive plan. His silence was not an act of passivity, but a profound statement of faith that God's purposes would prevail no matter what. Jesus' silence before Pilate offers another powerful example of trust in God's sovereignty. When Pilate questioned Him, Jesus chose not to answer, even though He could have easily spoken up to defend Himself. Pilate, perplexed by Jesus' silence, asked Him, "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" John 19:10. Jesus' response was simple but profound. "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above." John 19:11. In this moment, Jesus made a declaration of trust in God's authority over all things. He understood that Pilate's power was not his own, but had been allowed by God for a purpose. Jesus' silence was a powerful reminder that even when earthly powers appear to be in control, God is ultimately the one who governs all things. His trust in the Father's plan was so complete that He was willing to endure injustice, knowing that God was in control and would bring about His purposes in due time. Jesus' example teaches us a valuable lesson about the power of silence as a declaration of trust in God. When we are wronged, misunderstood, or falsely accused, we may feel the urge to speak up, to defend ourselves, or to demand justice. But Jesus shows us that sometimes the wisest and most powerful response is to remain silent, trusting that God will handle the situation. Jesus' silence was not a passive resignation, but an active surrender to the will of God. By remaining silent, He was acknowledging that God's plan was far greater than any momentary injustice He faced. He was declaring His faith in God's perfect timing and trustworthiness, knowing that the Father's purposes would be accomplished even through suffering and hardship. There are other instances in Scripture where silence is portrayed as an expression of trust in God. In the Old Testament, we find the example of Job, a man who suffered immensely yet chose to trust God despite his circumstances. Job lost his wealth, his health, and his family, and his friends accused him of wrongdoing. Yet, throughout his suffering, Job remained silent in his trust that God knew what he was doing. While Job did voice his complaints and confusion, he ultimately trusted God's sovereignty over his situation. In Job 13:15, he declares, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him." Job's trust in God, even in the midst of unspeakable pain, is a powerful declaration of faith. He chose not to demand answers from God or try to make sense of his suffering in his own understanding. Instead, he chose to trust that God knew what he was doing, even if it didn't make sense at the time. The prophet Isaiah also provides an example of silence as a declaration of trust in God. In Isaiah 53:7, we read that the Messiah would be oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. This prophecy points to the suffering of Jesus, who would endure great injustice without defending himself. Jesus' silence before his accusers, as foretold in Isaiah, was a testament to his deep trust in God's plan for salvation. He did not need to argue, explain, or defend himself because he trusted that his suffering was necessary for the redemption of humanity. His silence was not an admission of guilt or weakness, but an active choice to trust in the Father's will. In our own lives, choosing silence in difficult situations is a way of declaring that we trust God to handle our circumstances. When we remain silent in the face of criticism, unfair treatment, or misunderstandings, we are making a statement that says, "I trust God with this. I don't need to fight for myself. I know that He is in control." This trust is not a passive resignation to the circumstances. It is an active surrender to God's sovereignty. It is choosing to let go of our desire for control, to release the need to be vindicated, and to trust that God will work in ways that we may not fully understand. Silence is also a way of declaring our trust in God's justice. When we are wronged, it can be tempting to take matters into our own hands, to seek revenge, or to make sure that others know how we've been mistreated. But choosing silence is a declaration that we trust God to bring justice in His time and His way. Romans 12:19 tells us, "Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, 'It is mine to avenge, I will repay,' says the Lord." When we remain silent in the face of injustice, we are saying, "God is the judge, not me. He will right the wrongs in His time." This is not an easy thing to do, especially when we feel deeply hurt or wronged, but it is a powerful way to declare our trust in God's perfect justice. In some ways, silence can be seen as an act of obedience. God calls us to trust Him in all circumstances, and sometimes the most obedient response is to remain silent rather than to react impulsively or defend. Proverbs 3:5-6 encourages us to trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your paths straight. Choosing silence is an act of submitting to God's plan, even when we don't fully understand why we're facing a particular situation. It is a way of acknowledging that God's understanding far exceeds our own, and that He is the one who will make our paths straight. Silence is also a way of guarding our hearts. In moments of anger, hurt, or frustration, our words can easily become weapons. We may say things that we later regret or that cause further harm to others. By choosing silence, we are protecting ourselves from the temptation to speak out of anger or bitterness. Proverbs 15:01 tells us, "A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger." By remaining silent, we prevent our emotions from taking control of our actions, allowing us to respond with grace and wisdom instead of reacting impulsively. In every moment of silence, we are declaring our trust in God's timing and His plan. Whether we are facing injustice, misunderstanding, or personal attack, choosing to remain silent is a powerful statement of faith. It says, "I trust God with this. I trust that He knows what is best for me, and I trust that He will handle the situation according to His will." It is a surrender of our desire for control, a refusal to be governed by our emotions, and a declaration that we believe God is in control of all things. Silence becomes a testimony of our faith, a visible sign to others that we trust God, even when the world would expect us to react. By embracing silence as a declaration of trust in God, we follow the example set by Jesus Christ and countless others who have gone before us. We learn that in our quiet moments, God is at work. Our silence becomes an act of surrender, a powerful reminder that we do not need to fight for ourselves because God is our defender.